So, good evening to everyone here at Truckee Town Hall and to those who are watching on Tahoe Truckee Media. My name is Deirdre Henderson. I'm the group leader of the North Tahoe chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to Our Planet's Health is Our Health, the health effects of climate change and what we can do about it. When we think about climate change, we most often think about its environmental effects and its economic effects, especially in an outdoor recreation-based economy like ours. Tonight, we're going to learn about another implication of climate change, which is its effects on our health. We've assembled a wonderful group of medical doctors to do that, and we hope that what they have to say will spark some questions and conversation, and we'll have ample time to do that. Just to note, Dr. Lee Balance, who was going to be here, has had a family emergency, and he's not here, but Drs. Cutler and Miller will pinch hit for him. So CCL is honored to co-sponsor this community forum with the town of Truckee and with the Sierra Business Council, two of the most committed and active entities in our region in addressing climate change. We have many people to thank for making this forum a reality. First and foremost is Dr. Brad Miller, whose knowledge and medical community connections and enthusiasm made this forum possible. Hillary Hobbs, assistant to the Truckee Town Manager for her logistics help, Rory O'Farrell of Tahoe Truckee Media, and a wonderful group of North Tahoe CCL volunteers. Meg Heim, who coordinated the presentations, Daryl and Kotzenberg of DK Design Studio for her graphic arts help, and from our chapter's media team, Celeste Leon and Jana Bloomquist. So just a quick word about Citizens Climate Lobby. We're a grassroots, nonprofit, nonpartisan climate advocacy organization dedicated to building political will in our communities for national climate solutions. We act through over 400 volunteer-driven local chapters around the country. We have one here in North Tahoe. And we build respectful, long-term relationships with local citizens, with community leaders, public officials, the media, and very importantly, with our members of Congress. We train and plan and empower ourselves as citizen advocates to have substantive meetings with our Congress members and their staffs several times a year in district and in Washington, D.C. And we focus on shared values and a search for common ground rather than partisan divides. This approach has actually enabled us to build a lot of support in Congress for important climate policies, including the climate provisions of the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act. We like to say that we are the best lobbyists money can't buy. But we still have a lot more work to do. And if we want to leave a livable world to our children and grandchildren and future generations. So if you'd like to know more about us and consider joining us, please take a look at the table in the back of the room or go to cclusa.org. And now it's my pleasure to turn this over to Truckee's Mayor, Courtney Henderson.
Good evening, everyone. It is an incredible honor to be here with you all this evening. I'm so grateful to our esteemed panelists who are here to share your knowledge, your time, your expertise tonight, to all of our sponsors who made this event possible, and of course to all of you for being here, ready to engage, ready to learn, and ready to develop solutions for our community. It's also personally momentous to me that we're here this evening to talk about the interactions between climate and health. I spent the first decade of my career in public health and healthcare, working throughout the US and in countries abroad. When I was in India, I came to truly recognize the impacts of our changing climate on things like crops, family health, individual health, and so much more. I really embraced that realization that climate change truly is the greatest public health threat of our time. And I launched into what has now been a decade-long career in climate and clean energy. This is also a huge part of what motivated me to run for public office in 2020, to ensure that we're building a healthy community and a resilient tomorrow for all of us, for future generations to come. The town of Truckee has adopted 5 core goals, and it drives a lot of the work that we do. You can actually see them over there on the wall. One of those goals is to become a leader in environmental sustainability and in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Why is that? Well, in part because the effects of climate change over many decades threaten to impact our community like never before. Over the past years, we have witnessed some of the most destructive wildfire seasons in California's history. We have seen vast swings in our temperatures and in our snowpack. In Truckee, we are feeling the impacts of climate change, reduced air quality due to wildfire smoke, trail closures, which impact our ability to recreate and stay healthy physically and mentally, and even the threat of evacuation. What does this mean for our health? Well, the risks are vast. Increased respiratory health disorders, heat-induced stress, mental health complications, and more. Yet, the fields of public health and medicine offer real solutions. With that, I feel like I've come full circle being in this room with all of you tonight, and I can't wait to learn from our panelists this evening. So with that, I'll welcome our very first speaker, Dr. Ken Cutler.
Appreciate it. And do we have the microphone? Well, thank you, Mayor Henderson. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I really appreciate having you here and having a chance to talk to you about climate change and health. My role tonight with our panel is really to set the stage for their talks that are going to get into a little more specifics about climate change impacts on adult health, maternal child health, and mental health. And how I want to start is just to give a few ideas, ways to think about health and public health, and then also highlight some of the information that's coming out of major expert reports on climate change, and that we as a people put out billions of tons of greenhouse gases each year into the environment. That traps heat, that increases temperature, that changes our climate, and that comes back and affects our individual health, our community health, and our global health. So we'll try to make that case. So let me start by taking us back to, whoops, that way? And, sorry. It worked earlier. All right. Will you be able to advance the slides? Thanks. So for the next one, I want to take us back to 1948. So the world is coming out of a destructive Second World War and trying to rebuild. And so the World Health Organization, next slide please, is created, right? It's founded with the idea of bringing people together, improving our planet. And they needed a definition of health. And so they thought it's a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease, illness, infirmity. So criticisms of this are that it's still somewhat vague, what's well-being. It's hard to measure, but it did give us a richer, more holistic look at health than just being free of disease. So it was a powerful statement at the time. 40 years later, people started to look at that and say, health really isn't just a state. it waxes, it wanes, and it's more dynamic than that. So they added that health is really the extent to which an individual or group is able to realize aspirations, satisfy needs, and to change or cope with the environment. And that rings home today with what we're talking about. And it's really a change that brings in the ideas that our environment changes, we change, we need to be more resilient. And then people ask a lot, what is public health? And it's not what a public health official does, it's not what the public health department does, but really it's what we do collectively together to set the conditions in which people can be healthy. So we try to level the playing field. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, great. We haven't done a great job of it. If you look in the United States, the California Endowment had this campaign, right, that was really trying to say that zip code correlates with your life expectancy more than genetic code. So if you're born in Stockton, California, as opposed to Newport Beach, California, that's a 15-year difference in life expectancy. That's significant, that's profound. So it's on top of this that we are now going to layer on climate change, knowing that we have inequities, knowing that we have people who are more vulnerable. And as Mayor Henderson pointed out, this is from an preeminent journal in health, and they call climate change the greatest global health threat in the 21st century. They also say it's an opportunity for us, right, to really change the social determinants of our health, redesign where we work and play and live. So, and then one other thing I wanted to say was that when we talk climate, it's really important that we think long-term, right? Weather is those short-term variations. Climate is over decades. So when Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma in 2015 went on the Senate floor to dismiss that 2014 had been the warmest year on record, he brought a snowball, right? Because it was snowing outside in DC. But we know that's a disinformation campaign. We know that weather is variable, climate is longer term. Important concept. So in terms of the experts out there, there was the fourth National Climate Assessment back in 2017. The fifth assessment is due out in 2023. So looking forward to that. It's 477 pages. It's chock full of science and studies and information. But Dr. Mears, one of the contributing author, gave me this slide, which I appreciate, because he said Dr. Hayhoe, who's a Texas Tech professor on climate, really synthesized that report down to its main ingredients. So it's us, it's real, right? Climate change is real according to the report. A lot of evidence for that. It's us, it's human influence, it's human caused, at least the acceleration, the amplification, the intensification. It's here, it's not something that's happening in the future. Climate change is here, it's bad. I think she could have said people are suffering from it. It's getting worse, and we know that that is accelerating. But we can, the things that we choose to do can and do make a difference. Okay? So act now. So that's Dr. Hayhoe. Look at her website if you ever have a chance. Wanted to share just not a lot of the science and evidence behind, but there are two graphs I wanted to go over just briefly as background. So Mauna Loa Observatory has been in the news because of the volcanic eruption recently. So this is the Keeling curve. And so Dr. Keeling from Scripps had started to measure CO2 in the atmosphere there back in the late 1950s and measured it every day. And so it's the longest continuous measurement that we have of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And you can see, in the first couple of years, he was interested in those undulations, and he found that there was a seasonal variation. But then, the longer they looked, the higher it got. And since his death in 2005, it's only gone higher. Okay. this is the famous hockey stick graph of Professor Mann. So looking at global average temperatures going back, many years, even pre-industrial. And so this, if you look in the literature, has been attacked, criticized, vilified. So in 2005, Congress asked for the original data because they were skeptical. And the National Academies of Science put together a panel to review it. And for the most part, they said this was correct. They said from 1600 earlier, the range is probably a little bigger, but the rest has held. And so the hockey stick blade is just getting longer and longer. Okay? So another big report is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, put together by the UN, right? So their last report, it's really a compilation of 6 reports. They're going to put out a synthesis again in 2023. But they had key findings. All those greenhouse gas emissions, that heat trapping has created heat waves that are intensifying. They have increased our rainfall. So if you've noticed those atmospheric rivers that are becoming more common, bigger and more frightening. But at the same time, drought's increasing. I remember when a climatologist said it's not drought or flood, but it's drought and flood with climate change. And that's what the models show. Bigger, more frequent wildfires that we're all really concerned about, the ocean warming, acidifying, and changing sea life. So there's an environmental justice attorney who thinks that we should be talking about natural disasters in a different way, that it takes the responsibility away from us just to call them natural disasters anymore. And so because they're more frequent, they're bigger, they're more intense because of changes in our atmosphere, we have to come up with better terminology. I would love during the Q&A to hear your thoughts on that. Okay. So this is just heat waves. If you go, it can be frustrating because they are defined in different ways, whether it's 5 degrees above normal, 95th percentile above normal, etc. So people quibble about that. But really, frequency of heat waves is rising. The length of seasons that we're seeing heat waves is rising. How long they last is rising. And the intensity is rising. And you'll hear more about the impacts on health. This is really a graph and a figure of wildfire acreage in fire history in California. Dramatic increases that we're all worried about. 2018, if you remember the Camp Fire Paradise, 18,000 homes destroyed, 80 plus people killed. Washington Post did an article like, who's next? And where I live currently, where some of us do, Grass Valley, Nevada City, we're high on that list. So this is a real threat that causes anxiety, hypervigilance, to-go bags, ready to go. So another aspect of the IPCC report was, are we going to hit some of the goals that came out of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015? Are we going to limit our warming to 1.5 degrees, which is about 2.8 Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius, about 2.8 Fahrenheit above pre-industrial, so 1850s. Are we going to limit that rise? The answer is unfortunately unlikely, right? We're probably going to overshoot it because we're already at least 1.1 degrees above, maybe 1.2. We're going up about 0.2 every 10 years. So we may hit that somewhere 2030, 2040. It's possible. And what would it take to get us to stop there? We'd have to really have emissions peak next year, right? I don't know if we have the consensus, the political will to do that. We'd have to have them drop by 40% by 2030. Methane emissions would also have to drop. They're a strong climate driver. And even with that, emissions would have to go to net zero by 2015. Okay? So, is it going to be 1.5 degrees? Is it going to be 2 degrees? It matters. The higher it gets, the more intense the models get. The Yale Climate Connections is a really good resource to read articles about this. Okay? So here's just a few things. Is that if we shoot past, if we stay at 1.5 versus 2 degrees Celsius, it protects millions and millions of lives from poverty-related risks because of the impacts on drought, on floods, migration problems, etc. It changes our crop yields and it affects our gross domestic product. And I threw this in there because we all know that one of the arguments against going after climate change with real vigor is that it's going to be too expensive. But it's really expensive to ignore it. This, just locally, is also from Dr. Mears with that 4th climate assessment. And it's looking at snowpack, the water content in the snowpack. And you can see if we really shoot way past the 1.5, past 2 degrees into the end of the century, get to 4 degrees, 4.5 degrees that some people think we might get to, the snowpack up here is essentially gone. So a couple ideas that you'll hear about when you start looking into climate change is that we need to mitigate, which is really prevention, that we need to put less greenhouse gases out there or capture and store them better, and we need to adapt and prepare. And that's in the design of our cities, so that they're more flood resilient, runoff, doesn't just destroy houses. We have fire breaks for wildfire. We have cooling centers for heat, etc. So one of the things they said in the IPCC report is that our built cities of the future matter. So 2/3 of carbon emissions are coming out of urban areas. The migration in the world towards urban areas is huge. 1 million people every 5 days around the globe are moving into cities. So 60% of the projected urbanized area in the world by 2015 has yet to be built. And so there's real opportunity. So my time's about done. The other speakers are going to really focus on some of the other health impacts, but it has been shown that if you talk to people about the health impacts, not just the environmental impacts, they're more likely to support individual changes and some collective changes. And I just want to applaud all of those of you who work on health in other ways, like safe routes to schools. That's a climate action that you're taking. If you're working on asthma by trying to decrease diesel exhaust, you are helping climate and health. There are a lot of great co-benefits. And a lot of people, down in our area in the foothills have farms, local food production, less transportation with it, and they're doing health and climate work together. I'll save this for the Q&A, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brad Miller, who's going to really focus more on some of the adult impacts. So here you go, Brad. Thanks.
Thank you for all being here. I need to use my laptop because of certain technical learning how I did this in the past. So hopefully this is going to come right on. And this mic is on? Okay. Okay. Bear with me. Yikes. This is the first time we've done one of these in Truckee, so we're learning a lot. Pardon me. good my mouse works. So you can go to the next slide, please. Oh, where's my thing? Okay. I can go to the next slide. There it is. Okay. So we're going to now dive into some of the details about what Ken has so nicely set the stage for. And I'm just going to There's so many different ways to skin a cat now, technically, that I just happen to be on one side of the equation here. Okay, here we go. Good. So thanks to everyone who's made this happen, especially Deirdre, and I heartily second your thank yous to everyone, and to Meg especially for helping us get it together. So I have to do double clicking here, so sorry. No, I got it. It just takes, this is kind of a slow old jalopy of a computer. So, why am I here? That's why. I have a family. I'm a lover of the natural world, like I'm sure many of you are. I'm a retired doctor, so this is part of my vocation. I have a heart condition also, so I'm a patient. So I have a lot of reasons to be concerned about these matters. This is my family, my dear grandchildren. I care deeply about their health. And I'm also worried about the world that they're going to inherit. They've joined me in their love of the outdoors, backpacking, skiing, and I know these are values that probably everybody in this room shares. And we're going to come back to shared values in a bit. Okay. So these are the objectives for my talk. We're going to emphasize the concept that climate change is a threat multiplier, okay? It's like it's going to move things up to a whole other order of magnitude. We're going to look at this through a framework of shared values. In this case, as a physician, caring; as a father, grandfather, protecting. Climate change solutions are health solutions. And these are the particular areas of adult health that I'm going to review very quickly. It's a big area. The fourth National Climate Assessment dives deeply into this, as Ken alluded. We're really happy to have Dr. Haas here, who's going to go over the mental health aspects of this, which often get sort of an afterthought approach, and we're glad to have her dive deeper on that. So Nevada County, this is some older data, but obviously there's a lot of people at risk in our community. We all live in wildfire-prone areas, just about. A lot of people with chronic illnesses, older people like moi. A lot of outdoor workers. Again, this is older data. I wish I'd have brought it up to date, but I'm sure this is a bigger number now. Housing insecurity, I'm sure, is even worse now after the pandemic and the inflation and all that. So those are significant kind of baseline facts. Climate-related illness, just sort of big picture wise, there's nothing new. You know, there's none of the diseases we're going to talk about that are new. Weather events have always affected human life, but as Katharine Hayhoe, who is a great spokesperson and also has a new book out that I highly recommend, it's going to be like it's all on steroids. That's the threat multiplier concept. It's just going to, you know, rev the whole situation up to a level that's going to be very difficult. These are some references, oh, whoopsie daisy. Let's see. I didn't practice this. This double. Okay, so this is where the information comes from, by and large. My second portion of the talk, I'll tell you later where I got that information. But I'm really glad that my profession has tackled this. I can't tell you how much the whole medical profession is learning from these incredible publications. So, who are the most vulnerable people? Again, you can read the slide. This is very familiar to all of us because these are very similar to the groups that were the most vulnerable and still are with the COVID pandemic. People with chronic illnesses, older people, certain groups of people, urban, disadvantaged people who live in blighted neighborhoods, no airco, poor screening, heat islands. And so this is why the concept of climate justice has moved into kind of this foundational position in all of the policy discussions. So you'll be hearing more about that, and I think that the Biden administration has been speaking to this very significantly. So this is another kind of big picture slide. This is sort of this model that comes out of the fourth National Climate Assessment. Basically, climate change and health take place in this very complex human and geographic biological environment, and this kind of tries to just show you all those dynamics. Let's take a look at that for a moment. And this kind of dives a little bit deeper. This one basically, you know, in medicine and in lots of things, business, we like to look at root cause analysis, right? So this model that is kind of depicted here kind of takes it back to like the roots of like what human life is all about, and talks about these physical conditions of our world and moves it into the concept of exposure pathways. And then in red there are the illnesses, disease states that we're going to talk about. So first is extreme heat, and you know, in a lot of ways this is pretty obvious as a health risk. This is a highly variable thing though, because like a heat wave in San Francisco is really different in terms of the acclimatization to what somebody up here in the foothills or down in the valley would experience in terms of where they run into risk. But again, this is obvious, but also, you know, results in very severe forms of illness. This shows the spectrum of heat-related illnesses, heat stroke being on the extreme end of the scale. People die from that. It's a very difficult thing to manage when we see it as physicians. It is, of all of the conditions we're going to talk about this evening, the worldwide leading cause of death in terms of disease states and that connect to climate. Obviously, outdoor workers are the most vulnerable to this. A lot of construction needs to happen these days. It's hard to find a contractor, as you know. But these folks are out there at risk. Caltrans workers, farm workers, we depend on. These are essential workers. Interestingly, Cal OSHA has some very stringent requirements for what's supposed to happen. We'll come back to that in a bit in terms of how things really look. California in 2021, this is kind of going over some of the things Ken mentioned, was 2021 the hottest year on record in California. Our heat wave this September, from what I'm reading, was the hottest heat wave ever recorded in California. Other kind of points of reference: in Chicago, over 700 people died in a heat wave in '95, and in Europe in 2018, over 70,000 people died from heat. That's a staggering number to me. So outdoor air quality, this is the other kind of big area of concern. They're all of great concern, but these are the heat and the outdoor air quality. We already have very, very robust evidence that outdoor air quality has got a lot of very serious impacts on human health in terms of especially cardiovascular disease. This is both in urban and rural environments, and it's now, especially in our area, being magnified by wildfire, which, obviously invisibly impacts our air quality. The extent frequency of wildfire is obviously well known to all of you. So, and these are the most common serious illnesses I, as a general internist, dealt with throughout my career. And so imagine escalating that to a higher level with worsening air. And this slide's got a lot going on in it. But the key points of this is it defines the main air pollutants, which are ozone and particulates. There's a bunch of other ones, but these are kind of the big ones. Ozone tends to result in very acute symptoms, like if you're an asthmatic. Particle pollution impacts both acute and chronic symptoms, and it's really staggering to read the reports that you've probably seen in the press about how the pathologists are finding these fine particles in our bodies, in virtually all organs. It's found in fetal tissue, and it's like, oh my gosh. And it's not good for us. These studies are ongoing. We're still learning a lot about this. So I'll skip through some of these details, but currently we believe that at least 8 or 9 million people worldwide die as a result of air pollution. So once again, threat magnified, multiply those numbers. So this is some information from a really interesting report. Oh my, okay, that's not what my clock says. Anyway, this shows that as far as ozone, Nevada and Placer counties are the worst in the nation last year. And then particles, we're not on the top 10, but we're not good. This is from the Camp Fire. Up there in the top right of that is Grass Valley. Tahoe got off a little better during that, but we were in the extremely unhealthy range. Those are some images of Sacramento. And then this is a pretty recent study that the folks at UC Davis, the pulmonary medicine department, are doing fantastic research on this. This is farm workers out there. Did you know that your employer was supposed to give you a mask if the AQI is over 150? You go, kinda, sorta. And then did they give you a mask? And only 40% got a mask. Oh, gee. And some people want to deregulate everything. Quick sidebar, medications can be impacted by heat. So in your go bag, be ready to take care of your meds, keep them cool, have a go bag. More details are available on request. Water, flooding, Pakistan, Kentucky, you've seen it on the news, devastating to the infrastructure. There's sea level rise coming also. One projection for California says that over 1 million people are going to be in trouble by 2100. Drought, the Colorado River, I didn't know it was 1 out of 10 Americans depends on that for their water to sustain their lives, and it's really in bad shape. That image on the top is a old lady in the valley who hasn't been able to get clean, fresh water in her home for years. When there's big floods, it wrecks the infrastructure and disease runs rampant. I think cholera was really big in Pakistan in the last few months. Ken knows way more about this than I do. Disasters wreck the healthcare system, and this is pretty obvious. It also creates more trouble in terms of the supply chains. Lastly, really quick, Lyme disease geographies moving northward. This is an example of vector-borne diseases. This is mosquitoes and ticks. Ticks for Lyme's, and mosquitoes carry other pathogens that are mentioned here, and details we can get into later because I got to wrap it up. So food quality is last but not least. Basically, food insecurity is a baseline issue for a lot of people around the world, more in our country now with inflation and job loss and all that. This is threat multiplication at its most profound level, and malnutrition is really bad for your health. So this is one of these busy medical slides that puts it all together. This is how climate change creates these exposure pathways, risks, difficult outcomes. It all cascades and interacts, and it's not a pretty picture. So this is a beautiful quote from Katharine Hayhoe to emphasize Ken's point that he made earlier. So, Sarah, my friend and colleague, one of the champion doctors of Nevada County. So here's your slide advancer.
I'm just looking for the microphone.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Okay, is this on? All right. Thank you for having me. And my job is to talk to you about kids. I'll limit my comments to how children are different. And part of this will sort of echo. I'm not sure that this is going to work. There we go. I'm a pediatrician. I've been practicing for 40 years in Nevada City, Grass Valley, which is where I grew up. And during that time, I have seen a lot of changes in the climate just locally. I think it's really important for us all to remember that we are here because we care about the future. And the kids that are growing up now are growing up in a far different world. You are. There are young people here as well as people my age. And so we are doing this for the health of the planet and for their future. So the 2 points I want to emphasize the most: kids are more vulnerable to many things, and they are our future. Okay, how are kids different than adults? Well, obviously they're littler, most of them, but physiologically they're different, and this makes them more susceptible to some of the factors that Brad was discussing. They are rounder, so they have a larger surface area for their weight, so they can lose heat more readily, and they can also sometimes have trouble getting rid of heat. So they're more susceptible to temperature extremes. They have a faster metabolic rate. Babies born, it's normal for them to breathe 60 times a minute. A 2-year-old should be breathing 30 times a minute. We breathe 12 times a minute. So they are taking air in and out at a much more rapid rate. And so they are breathing in these particles that we're talking about more often. They also have developing organs. So the things that are getting into their bloodstreams, getting into their lungs, are going to their liver, to their kidney, to their brain. And so some of these toxins are affecting them. Our brains are done by the time we're 25 to 30, although some of us keep going, but in terms of development, these are really crucial years when these kids are small. So our job is to protect them from some of the toxins in the environment. And of course, they are dependent on us. So they need our love, they need our support, they need our physical care. And when we're in circumstances that we can't do that, that creates a lot of stress. Beth's going to talk about that later. I do a lot of traveling. I go to Uganda. I go to Nicaragua probably 20 times. And I just got back from the Dominican Republic in June. So when you travel, you see how the rest of the world is doing. And we're having problems here, but other places you can multiply that by 10, 20 times. So the effects on children, same as the effects on adult, except exacerbated. So heat-related illness is a big one. Kids, as we know, every year kids die in cars. People leave their windows rolled up. But kids are dying on playing fields when they're practicing. They're dying on playgrounds that aren't well designed. Many playgrounds are designed with asphalt, turf, and things, which can very much increase the temperature on the ground. Kids are littler, they're closer to the ground. So we're learning that we have to design our world so that it's safer for kids, because they can die much more quickly or suffer the effects faster than adults. Air quality effects, there's just a big study out about probably there have been 1 million stillborn pregnancies attributed to decreases in air quality in the last per year in the last few years. During pregnancy, what the mother is exposed to can affect the developing fetus, and we're just getting more and more information about that. But we have to remember that that the fetus is exposed to these things as well as the children once they're born. Infectious diseases, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And all these things that we've already mentioned, all those effects exacerbated in kids. Okay, so again, the heat-related illness is the leading cause of environmental deaths in the world. It's increasing, and younger you are, the more vulnerable. These are Batwa pygmy children in Uganda. That's a little girl and her sister. We were building a new house for them from mud. They don't go to school. They don't have a school inside. Their school is outside. So when their world heats up, they get hotter, and they don't have any place to go to get away from the heat. When you talk about air quality effects, these are the areas that have already been mentioned. We are definitely seeing an increase in asthma in kids due to air quality and probably multifactorial. Wildfires, of course, greatly increase this. And infections, the infections that affect kids the most are things where they can become dehydrated. So if we get a stomach flu, we will sort of get sick, and we can sort of drink and remember to try to hydrate, and we'll go to the emergency room if we don't feel well. But kids can get dehydrated very quickly. Right now there's a cholera outbreak in the Congo, which is right next to Uganda, very close to where I go to work with the pygmies. And I'm sure they're losing kids very rapidly, because cholera is something that will just empty your circulatory system very quickly. All these germs will increase as the temperature goes up. we'll see more and more of these germs coming into the temperate climates, not just the tropical climates. And then vector-borne diseases, these are things where something bites you and you get sick. One of the first patients I saw when I got to Uganda, I was supposed to just help in a dental clinic, and there was a child on a mat seizing, and they gave me the child and we drove right back to the hospital. He had cerebral malaria. And malaria is a huge killer in the whole world, as we know. But that's going to be increasing. Dengue fever, Zika, which I saw kids with Zika in Dominican Republic. All those things are going to go up in numbers as the climate changes. That's a given. And then extreme weather events, such as the flooding. When you're little and you can't swim, it's a little easier for you to get swept away. We've seen that on the news with the most recent flooding in Pakistan. I don't know the numbers, but I'm sure they lost many children. And tornadoes. If a child's body can fly through the air more easily, and so all these extreme events, kids are just more vulnerable, and that's just a given. And then one thing I wanted to mention was nature deficit disorder. One of the recent pediatrics conferences I went to, the keynote speaker of the Academy of Pediatrics talked about nature deficit disorder. Many kids are growing up in urban environments. Some of them have never actually seen the stars. They've never slept outside. They don't know what it is to raise a garden. And when you have that detachment from nature, that gives you a different perspective on things. And so part of our role in educating people about climate change is to talk about nature and the importance of the world. And so as pediatricians, this is another area that we're trying to focus on, is getting kids outside, getting them to exercise, and to have a reverence for the planet, which is what they're going to inherit and what they need to take care of. These are things we never talked about at all 40 years ago when I was in medical school. You just had to learn how to give IV fluids and read blood tests. Pediatrics has changed completely. This is a school where the little Batwa kids are going, and you could see their chalkboard there. But if their outside temperature goes up higher, kids have a harder time getting rid of their heat. Sometimes they don't sweat as easily. And if you have that on top of malnutrition and other things, some of these kids may not be there in the future. Okay, nutrition. Kids have higher metabolic needs. They need calories. They need high quality calories. And there is some interesting work coming out about increased CO2 in the environment and how certain crops grown in that environment, you may get more yield, but they may be lacking in certain micronutrients, especially zinc, protein. So even though food is being grown in some of these countries, the nutritional value may be going down. And when you have borderline food supplies to begin with, and then you knock out some of those nutrients, that can also impact the child's health. Sorry to have all these pictures, but these kids are so cute. All right, this is something I'll just mention. I know this is the topic that's coming up, which I'm very interested to listen to, but we are dealing much more in pediatrics now with children's mental health. COVID certainly did not help that, but as we know, kids are vulnerable to stress, and that's intuitive, but in pediatrics now, we screen all children at their well cares with something called an ACE screen. That's Adverse Childhood Events. And that is because if when you're young in the first 3 to 5 years of life, if you are exposed to major stress, such as loss of a parent, divorce of a parent, seeing violence occur in your family, there are 10 items that are asked about, that your risk of having health issues as an adult is multiplied many, many times. So you're much more likely to have hypertension or diabetes or cancer if you had these adverse mental health events as a child. So when you add on top of that the stress of flooding or drought or population issues, if things affecting your parents' income, all these things that are going to be multiplied by climate change. We are looking at the next generations of people who may not be as healthy to begin with because of these things. So I know this is a downer, but the important thing about this is that we can help with this. We know what the problem is and we know what we need to do. And by the way, this is a great family. I just have to tell this story. I was asked to come examine these kids. Both parents had died of AIDS. The 16-year-old was raising the 5 siblings, and the 14-year-old was out getting food, so I didn't see those. And yet these kids were so happy and having so much fun. They had the security of having their family for whatever it was. And when you have that security in those young years, that sets you up for a good life. So if we can provide security, if we can provide a plan for what we're doing to help, that's what our kids need. And that way they can participate in it as they get older. So what do we do? What do I do as a pediatrician? First thing is to accept that we have a problem. Obviously, we have a problem. Acknowledge that it exists. We can adapt to certain things, but then action is the most important thing. So when I retire in January, I only have 3 more weeks of clinic, then I retire. And but my plan is to get much more involved in the environmental, in the climate action. I think as pediatricians we need to do more. I just went to a conference in Monterey. In 3 days, they only mentioned climate change once, and that was regarding tropical diseases. So obviously, we need to keep pushing our societies to put this at the forefront. So I'll be happy to answer questions during the break, and I think I did my time. Yes, good, thank you. I'm not sure, I'm supposed to introduce the next speaker. Oh, good. This is Elizabeth Haas, who's a psychiatrist and has...
Okay, thank you.
You want that?
Yeah, thank you. Everybody, big breath in. Blow it out hard. One more. That is called a cannon breath. Do this. 15 seconds. Breath of fire. Okay? When I catch my breath, I'll be okay. Hopefully you will feel slightly more energized than you were feeling. It's been an hour that we've been sitting here listening, so that's a little bit hard. So where's my little clicker guy? I'm Beth Haas. I work at Carson Tahoe Hospital, and in my free time, I work with not children. I do not work with children. They are very fun. I wish I worked with children, and I love the big blue globe. There we go. I work with a group called the Climate Psychiatry Alliance. This is a group of people who realized a few years ago that mental health was the forgotten stepchild of the entire climate change health approach, and we have been going around saying, it's very upsetting. Nobody seemed to have realized it was going to be very upsetting, so that's what we do, and people seem to be quite interested in that. My daughter tells me I like to be a marginal, so I think it suits me. So anyways, here are the 4 basic impacts of climate change, right? Heat, air pollution, habitat change, extreme weather, right? They come with all those other things that we've been hearing about, all the extreme weather impacts, all these food shortages, infectious diseases, right? And those things actually have mental health consequences. For example, if you go through a prolonged drought, you have about a 10% chance, if you're a farmer in India, of getting depressed, especially if you lose an animal, and then committing suicide. So one example that these things have mental health implications. This is how I sort of organize my thinking. Each of those impacts, right, has particular direct health effects, and we've been hearing about those, right? But what you might not have heard about is, for example, the CNS effects, the central nervous system effects, of having malaria, which can cause seizures, etc. The Lyme disease effects on the brain, for example, for vector-borne illnesses. Nutritional illness, when your zinc levels drop, your iron levels drop, you're more prone to depression, you may be more prone to bipolar disorder. When you have an accidental death in your family from extreme weather, you may get acute stress disorder, you might get post-traumatic stress disorder, but you also lost your family member, right? So now you may lose your income, you may get depressed because of that, you have chronic stress on your children. So these are the things that sort of got forgotten about. Right? Women, it turns out, have a fairly significantly increased risk of preterm birth and stillbirth when they're pregnant, and there is a high heat wave, right? We're learning about this more. A stillbirth is a very major mental health event, right? These are things that people carry with them for life. In terms of psychiatry, right, the heat and air pollution have very direct effects on the brain. And the implications of that is that heat increases violence. I'll talk about that in a second, right? Heat also causes stroke and heart attacks, right? And people with stroke and heart attacks have about a 70% chance of getting depressed, right? Air pollution is associated with so many psychiatric diagnoses, which I will also talk about, as well as Parkinson's disease and other kinds of things that have mental health effects. And air pollution is independently of heat associated with increased suicide. So when you guys have your wildfires here, you have two things that are increasing the inflammation in your brain, which is making it more likely that you're going to kill yourself if you're in the state of mind that you might do that otherwise. Right? Okay, so in addition, we then get into the things that affect communities, right? So we have all this stuff going on. People are homeless, people are sick, people have lost their father, and that creates conflict, or they're starving, and then they get worried and they want to go to the city to see if they can get some food. And all of these things lead to migration and civic unrest, and that is stressful. That is very stressful. Right. There are huge social justice implications of climate change, obviously, right? And these are actually national security threats, right? Our military is going to be more stressed by them. They've been saying for over a decade that climate change is the #1 threat to our national security, right? So we have impaired first responders, impaired military trying to respond to a situation of increased geopolitical conflict. That's not good for your mental health. And so as a result of all of that, you get all this. And that's really sort of the main point of these first few slides, is this stuff piles on each other. And what you come out with are a number of syndromes that are associated with losing your contact with nature, right? Solastalgia is the experience of looking at a mountaintop that used to have snow on it and now it doesn't, and you feel a kind of sad nostalgia, a longing for the way that it used to be. Nature deficit disorder we just heard about. People get really nihilistic, they develop eco-anxiety, they develop eco-grief. These are not formal syndromes, but they're words that we are using to describe the way people feel when they feel sad or anxious about what is happening. So that all sort of goes together. So that's the kind of hot mental health mess that climate change is, yeah? And we're going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about what you can do about it for yourself, managing yourself. But first I have to give you a little bit more bad news. Okay, so air pollution. Go back. Air pollution, as we've heard, is made up of these very tiny particles, the very ultrafine particles. You can fit 500 on a human hair. Those things go up your olfactory bulb, they go into your lungs and into your vasculature, and they migrate into your brain. And then it's like you put sand in your brain. When you put sand in your brain gets inflamed, yeah? And that's where we think, because a lot of inflammatory markers are very clearly up, the effects of air pollution on the brain are coming from. Those effects are about almost a twofold risk of autism if you live very close to a highway or some other place where the air quality is very poor. It's about 1.7%. Same for Parkinson's disease. Dementia, the risk is dramatically increased, which I'll talk about in a second. And for kids, living close to a highway or close to a place where they're getting a lot of traffic-related air pollution, next to a coal plant, right, for example, you can show that if they live there, they will have lower IQs, their brains will have changes similar to Alzheimer's disease. And if you close the coal plant, right, the kids that are born after that will not have those problems, right? So there are a lot of attentional problems, behavioral problems, IQ problems associated with living close to fossil fuel air pollution. This is one study on dementia and dementia and air pollution. There are 1,000 studies on dementia and air pollution. The Lancet has now made air pollution a risk factor for dementia, which is more than the risk of drinking too much, and about the same as not being able to hear. Yeah? And this is just one study, just to give you some idea of how these things are done. This is out of USC. They looked at women in a women's health study over a course of 3 years, and these are older women, right? And they looked at their air pollution exposure, and the ones that lived with bad quality air had about double the risk of developing dementia over those 3 years, right? They also lost about 6 centimeters of brain in 3 years. These are older women whose brains are aging already, yeah? And they gave the same air pollution to the little mices, right? And they studied the mices too, and the mices that had the ApoE4 gene, the Alzheimer's risk gene, right, showed Alzheimer's type changes in their brains with increased beta amyloid and sort of typical changes that you would expect to see in dementia. And we didn't slice up the women's brains and look at them, what we did with the poor little mices. Yeah. Okay, so that was just one study, but one of many pointing out this association between dementia and air pollution. What you can do is you can get an air filter. It has to be a very high quality one. Wired recommends the Coway air filters. So when you guys have wildfires, even if you can get your sleep, be in a room where you have a good quality air filter when you're sleeping, you're doing good things for yourself. Okay, heat. Heard a lot about heat already. A little more bad news. If you take anxiolytic drugs like benzodiazepines, you have about a double risk of going to the hospital during a heat stroke. Also, anticholinergics and antipsychotic drugs, not good during heat waves. If you're taking those medications, you need to be more careful. And if you're an old man with dementia or you drink during a heat wave, again, increased risk of heat-related illness. So those are groups that we see a lot of. Heat increases your risk of suicide. What you're supposed to get out of this slide is to see that all the slides from this distance kind of look the same, right? See how they all kind of look the same? The middle point is where the temperature is temperate. It's usually about 75, 80 degrees. Right. For every 1 degree Celsius, that's almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit, over that, the risk of suicide goes up about 1%. Right? The group that did this middle study feels that if we keep going the way we are in terms of temperature, we will have wiped out the gains of all of our suicide prevention programs by the year 2050 by the number of increased suicides from heat. Very sad. And this is the data for violence. So you can see this is a year. I love this slide. It was done by a professor of criminology, and he looked at the number of violent crimes in Chicago and the temperature, and he graphed it out. And you can, I like it just because you can see how tight the correlation is, right? The hotter it gets, the more violent crime there is. There's a lot of other ways to look at this. This is another one. This is a meta-analysis, meaning we put together 10,000 studies that all were looking at the influence of heat on conflict. Yeah? And again, the gist of this is the lines are going up towards the right. The hotter it gets, the more violent crime there is. And what was interesting about this study was just brilliantly done is they broke it down by types of conflict. So in the bottom left, civil war, right? Violent individual crime, rape, group-on-group violence, global tropical conflict. So for all different kinds of violence, right, as the temperatures went up, the level of violence went up. So I think that's mostly the end of the very, very, very bad news. What can you do about it for yourself? So, this is not fun, right? And it tends to lead to these kind of mental states. One state is the state of being in and or between a disaster. You're kind of always on this roller coaster of recovery, another disaster, recovery, this polycrisis that we've been experiencing for the last few years. We don't know that much about that psychiatrically or psychologically, but it's one thing to be aware of, trying to figure out. It leads often to these states of sort of collapsing, shutting down the way you may be feeling right now, like, right? And it leads to a lot of what some people have called pre-traumatic stress disorder, like, oh my God, everybody in the entire world is going to die, right? My family's all going to die, so that you have disabling pre-traumatic anxiety of what's coming. You could consider that existential anxiety as well. And then these other forms of sort of sadness that we talked about a little bit earlier. So how should you manage them? The first thing is, don't be like the parents in the picture. Don't ignore your feelings, okay? It is very difficult to do this work without doing some deep emotional processing of what you are feeling. I know that sounds really shrinky, but it's true, right? You can't actually work on it well unless you work with the dark parts of your feelings in a meaningful way. our disaster psychology is sort of shown on this graph here. Usually when we have some sort of disaster hitting us, climate being one of them, right? We have this sort of introductory phase where we're nervous, and then we have this honeymoon phase. Everybody turns out and has a rock and roll concert and tries to help the nice people that have suffered, right? And then things start to fall apart and we forget about everybody. And that's when your insurance payment doesn't come through. That's when you're not sleeping because you can't sleep anymore because you're so financially stressed, and then you start to drink, and then there's more substance abuse, and then there's more child abuse, and things really get sort of very dark. We try to cut that off at the pass by having this American model of resilience. Let's just bounce back cheerfully. I hate the word resilience, right? Because it doesn't help us deal with the actual problems that people are going through. And if you are in such a crisis, right, if you are super dysregulated, if you are not doing well, right, you really can gain a lot by going through a process which is called post-traumatic growth, meaning that you immerse yourself in what you've been through. You try to find your own core values, your own strengths in how you get through difficult things and what means most to you in the situation that you are in. Yeah? And then you try to work in what's called meaning-based coping, right, towards a better outcome. It takes longer, it's a lot harder, there are more setbacks, but people come out of it with the values on the far right. They have more spirituality, they tend to be stronger, or they see themselves as stronger, they're more empathic with other people, and they have a lot closer relationships than they had before. Right? So working on your feelings is an important thing. Basics of working on your feelings. I have a few extra minutes, I think, which is cool. Do validate that this is frightening and difficult. Okay, don't let people tell you that you're exaggerating and it's not going to be that bad. You need to start from truth. It does matter, and you have to start to let yourself confront the ways that you are participating in it, right? We have a very difficult time because we are in a culture which tells us to behave one way, and we have a climate reality which we need to behave another way. Yeah. And so an example of disavowal as a defense would be people that are at a dinner party bemoaning the fact that it was very difficult to get to the dinner party because there was very bad weather, right? But they flew there, right? Yeah. So that would be an example of behaving a certain way, flying, and then knowing that there's something sort of vaguely wrong with that, right? Or you go shopping and you buy something that you know to be not sustainable because it really feels like, oh, that's what everybody does, right? But at the same time, there's sort of this grating feeling like, there's something that I don't like about the way I am, yeah? And sort of starting to let yourself feel that is helpful, yeah? Don't sit on your anxiety when you have a real fear something bad is going to happen. Do not try to talk yourself out of it. It's not a panic attack. You're not supposed to let it wash over you. You're supposed to prepare for the things that are coming with climate change, right? So take action, effective action, to prepare in community with other people. That is a good way to work with climate anxiety, yeah? And practice active hope. Active hope is what we're doing right now. You're doing something which might not make a huge difference in the long run, but it's worth doing. Okay, so it's engaging in something, maybe growing a garden or maybe starting to work with a group of people. You're not expecting that this event is going to change the world, right? We're not expecting that, you know, the whole town of Truckee will suddenly see the light, right? But slowly, by sort of chipping away at things, that can make a difference. And you can be hopeful when you go to an event like this if you take that approach to it. Hope that was clear. And then also, love your mother, right? Mother Gaia in this case, yeah? You need to have a secure relationship with the natural world. Many kids don't these days. And so really allowing yourself to feel that that relationship is a loving relationship in which Mother Gaia is giving you things and you have to therefore take care of her, right? Being able to have that kind of secure, interdependent, reciprocal, empathic relationship with the planet is really important if you're going to appreciate what you need to do, right? I'm not going to dump paint down the drain if I know I'm drinking it in 5 days, right? I'm going to care about what I'm doing. So, and I know this may sound sort of obvious in this community, but it's not obvious to a lot of people, right? That there's actually a feedback loop, that if you don't take care of the air, you're not going to have anything to breathe, yeah? So those are the basics. The other thing is that this is a very sort of uncertain and difficult kind of experience that we're in. Much like this rhino, we don't really know where we're going. And so, as I said, it can be confusing and you can be in a state of collapse, yeah? We have found that there's certain metaphors that kind of work in getting you out of the state of collapse, right? The first is this idea of thinking yourself as kind of like a baby or an infant. And the way that I mean that is, you know the way that infants are when they are just learning to speak or kind of sitting at the dining room table and they're kind of like, Yeah? That state of quiet alertness, they're not judging themselves. They're not anxious about the fact that they don't know everything that's happening. They're ready to learn. And we are all coming at this in our own way. It's not your fault you were born into the culture that you were, right? Allow yourself to be in that position of openness. I'm going to go to the bottom two now. Embrace uncertainty. Uncertainty is possibility. It can feel very confusing that we don't know all the things that are going to happen and all the different forces that are come together and how fast is it going to happen, right? But when you don't know, that is a realm of possibility. Yeah. When you get super tired, you might be super tired, right? The group that I work with has found that that is a good time to stop talking. And you will find that you think of a joke. You might find something slightly ridiculous, right? Or you might get an idea. And often that idea can be very helpful as something that's been kind of brewing in the back of your mind that you might be able to act on. And the final idea is this idea of dialectics that we came up with, which is that we're often in this position of like extremes, right? We're asked to be hopeless, but just hopeful, but the situation is actually very hopeless, yeah? How do you walk those things, easily? We live in a climate reality. It's going very fast. We live in a social reality that changes very slowly. And that if you're in one of those positions and you're like, I feel so hopeless, or I feel way hopeful, it can be helpful to try on the other, right? If I viewed this situation with hopefulness or hopelessness, how would it change the way I proceeded to solve this problem? And I don't think I really have time to actually explain that very clearly, but maybe we can talk about it later. Okay, so it all depends on how you look at it. 2 more minutes? Yep, okay. So acceptance and commitment therapy is a kind of psychotherapy that is helpful around climate change. Right? And the basic principles of ACT are that people get stuck in the past, right? Oh my God, I can never go forward in life because I lost such and such. Right? Or in the future, someday I'm going to be a blah, 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 even though I'm doing nothing now. Yeah? They get stuck in a rigid story about that. They are avoiding something through those stories, and it tends to take them away from who they know they are. Right? And there's some things listed on the right there that you can do to shake yourself out if you feel like you're stuck someplace around the emotions of climate change. When you are upset, it is very helpful. I love it when my patients are super mad and sad, because that tells me that there's something that they care enough about to be mad or sad, right? So under mad or sad is a very good value that you could then act on. Yeah, you can make up a new story how you want to live, tell it to other people, make a list of things you want to do, challenge yourself to do it. Rituals are helpful, and practicing sentences that start with I will. I'm going fast in the interest of time. There are several group therapies for climate anxiety. The Climate Cafe is the most basic. Get together, talk to other people about climate change, share your story. The Good Grief Network. It's a sort of 12-step program for climate grief. We'll talk about them more in a minute. And then there are two that I really like. This is the deep adaptation model by Jim Bendell, which is the idea that for a lot of scientists and other people who've been working deeply in this area, they really are aware that there is some kind of collapse coming. It's not going to be easy, right? And so it starts with upper right, the idea of collapse awareness, that there's certain ways that you have to deal with collapse: acceptance, resistance, transcendence, transformation. And to think about those 4 pillars in terms of how you're going to respond to the difficulties. And then to ask yourself the 4R questions of the deep adaptation model. Okay? What do you want to keep? What can you afford to give up? What could you bring back from some earlier time in your life that might be valuable, or the past? And with whom do you need to make peace? And with what creatures and parts of the planet do we need to make peace in this difficult time? Okay? And then the last is the deep ecology work, the work that reconnects. And this is a program that was developed. Joanna Macy, who is a Buddhist scholar, and her colleagues developed this work. It's absolutely wonderful. It's based on the idea that, we're not in a hierarchy with man on top who deserves to exploit everything below it, but rather every being has intrinsic value. And it works to sort of reconnect us in gratitude, like we were talking about before, being aware of the reciprocal relationships. And it includes a lot of exercises that build your empathic relationship with the natural world. So, things like, would you like to speak about what's happening in your community from the voice of a bear? right? Would you like to read a speech to a chief that lost his lands 200 years ago as to what you've done with the lands that you took from him, right? Things like that. And they are particularly right now working on racial hierarchies and trying to get people out of racial hierarchical thinking. So those are some of the things that we can do. There's a bunch of stuff that we can do medically, which we can go over. It's a list. It's be online. Thank you. I like Yosemite.
Thank you so much. No. Okay. Wow. Thank you. That was very, very moving and valuable. Oh boy, I wish I'd have done this whole thing differently. So this is the part of the program where I'm going to try to help tell a new story to dovetail with Dr. Haas. This is where we're going to talk about, oh shoot, oh dang it. No, I just pushed the wrong button. Darn it. There we go. Okay. You know, after we've sounded the alarm here, and it's like time to take some more deep breaths and breathe deeply and try to stay connected inside and outside. We really need to look at the actions that we can take. I mean, this is a big part of what Dr. Haas was just talking about. And so I need to get to where I'm going here. And okay. So you can go, I can go to the next slide. So what the heck can we do about all this? And this is a very, very complicated topic that I'm going to try to give some highlights to in the next few minutes, and I'm going to try to tighten it up so we have some Q&A here. So I think that this framework of health is a really important point to kind of connect to our motivation and what we all care about the most. This is about threat perception, and I think I'm going to just skip over this, but let's just say that people do recognize this as a problem. Ken alluded to the Yale climate connection work, and this comes out of that, and it's basically shows us that the majority of Americans are on board with this, and there's this weird disconnect with our politicians. Policy opinions, basically, it's pretty hard to read that, but this is about taking actions. And, you know, the yellow bars there show that there's broad support for we got to get on this. So these are the big players in the whole problem. These are the sectors of, this is in the US, the greenhouse gas emissions come from all of these sources, and you're familiar with this. We have a big job ahead. Ken showed a slide very similar to this. These are the different pathways if we do nothing versus the ideal pathway down to the Paris Accord level of action. This is what Ken was talking about here. This is some best case scenarios that the Washington Post put together just last week. I found this, and this shows the overshoot that Ken was talking about. That's where we wind up with a situation where basically we're not going to meet our goals, and a lot of people are going to be harmed by that. And so, I'm sorry. So what about the individual level? This is where a lot of us think about, I'm just going to wing it here. This is just ridiculous. So we think in terms of, what can I do? Think globally, act locally. And this is a wonderful phrase that I think all of us have taken to heart. We're very familiar with lots of things we can do. I have an EV, put solar panels on the house. It's very expensive. There's lots of things. I want to get an electric chainsaw for Christmas. That's really cool. But it turns out that the experts know and advise us that that's going to take care of less than a quarter of the problem, okay? Sidebar, I know that in this community, most people have thought about and have prepared a plan for your family, your neighborhood in terms of evacuation, creating defensible space, air filters. The Air Now app, I'll bet everybody in this room is all over that. I check it every day during the fire season. Community shelters, know your resources and be prepared. Okay, that's really key. This is in the adaptation arena. The other thing all the experts talk about, and Katharine Hayhoe is the genius around climate communication. Her new book is about hope. A very, very sophisticated book. But to engage with other people, which is thought to be extremely important, it's really a good idea to start with values. And you can do your own values inventory and be ready to share that with other people and inquire about their values. I talked about my values earlier. But other people, maybe in the Republican Party want to talk about national defense. And it's really mind-boggling to see how well the Defense Department understands the significance and importance of dealing with all this. It's a national security issue. So you can connect with people and talk about it. The other personal choice is to be engaged, vote, work on trying to get climate aware politicians on the job. Okay, unfortunately, Kermit Jones, who was on board with this, lost the election, but it's not for lack of effort and support. And he would have been a great guy on that job. Deirdre organized a wonderful meeting with him. And then there's some fantastic advocacy organizations, and Citizens Climate Lobby, which I've worked with a fair amount, is very sophisticated. Their training is fantastic, so check it out. Climate Health Now is a wonderful organization for those of you who are interested in health care and climate. Some fireballs are running that one. So this is sort of, we got to move it to the big level. We have to deal with this as a society, as a world community. And this is a very complicated topic, and I'm indebted to Ezra Klein, who has a great podcast, and he interviewed this guy named Jesse Jenkins, who's a Princeton climate guy who is a policy guy also, and he's been a really big voice in this. And basically he points out it took us 140 years to create our current power system in the world, but we've got 30 years left. And the other source for this is Bill McKibben. He says this is the first time trial that we've got in world history where, it could be too late. The magnitude of what we need to do in the industrial world, the economy, is massive, but we've done it before. World War II is one fantastic example of that. The New Deal, that's Tennessee Valley Authority. We can do these things. The moonshot, by the way, today's Pearl Harbor Day, kaboom, and then we just completely turned around our economy and achieved some amazing goals. This is information about the energy picture of the future, and those are the major components. The experts believe we're going to need to do everything, okay, to decarbonize. We're going to need to deal somehow with nuclear power. There's a quaint picture of a nuclear power plant of the future, a lovely small scale thing that's going to be safer, they say. There's a geothermal plant there. We need to have battery and grid systems that can deal with a massive escalation of solar power, and that's what's pictured in the bottom right. Watch for those Tesla trucks. They're going to be delivering Pepsi Cola to a neighborhood near you. Carbon capture, hotly debated topic, very controversial. Some people think that it's just for the birds, extremely expensive, never been demonstrated at scale, but folks like Jenkins think that we may need to apply this in very selective ways. Ken did a nice presentation about the urban environment, the built environment. 2/3 of New York City's greenhouse gases come from the buildings. They have a new law, I think it's 97, that's going to put a price on, or it's going to create some ceilings for emissions for people who run buildings over 25,000 square feet, and it's going to grow in the next few decades. That picture at the bottom there is this futuristic design of a big mobile dike that's going to protect against the storm surges. That's the Hudson River, and it's like, tens of billions of dollars to build stuff like that. So that's on the books in New York. So policy. A lot has to happen at governmental levels, international cooperation, and we can see that that's been an uphill battle. This is the concept behind the work of Citizens Climate Lobby. It's to basically put a tax or a fee on carbon, collect the money, and dividend it back to households, okay? This has been studied a lot. A number, I think it's at last count, over 2,000 economists have endorsed this, many of them Nobel Prize winners. But politically, we're in a tough spot with that one. So here's good news. You're waiting for the good news, right? The Inflation Reduction Act, and I've shrunk it into a slide. I think it's like over 700-page document. I haven't read it, but this is a synopsis that Jenkins and Bill McKibben brought to me. And it uses incentives, basically, and it's done some changes in the tax system to pay for it. But this is going to promote a lot of really good things. And the thing I like the most, and this is something that really resonates with Ken's words, is it values clean energy and air as a public good. Wow. And this is the biggest thing that's ever been done by our government. And it's not enough. Can't be the last step, but it's something. And hopefully it's going to rev up some markets and, get us started towards the next step. And, the cost of all of these things is dropping. It's got a lot more attention from businesses. Amazon is putting it in their trucks with EVs and all that. These industries are growing. It's become a much more normalized part of our public discourse, and I think that's something to celebrate. I mean, compared to even 5 years ago, this is like really in there in a lot of people's thinking. Last thing, I'll go over here. You can also take the follow the money. Those of us who grew up with Watergate know the story behind that. But this is an amazing organization that Bill McKibben started called Third Act. And basically this is a busy slide that shows how the banking industry is funding the fossil fuel industries and making it all happen and continue to happen when it needs to go away. And so Third Act, check it out online. Next March, they're going to have a nationwide event that I think you'll be hearing about. I was going to make a joke about will be wild, but it's not really going to be wild. It's going to be very well thought out, and wait till then to shred your credit card from Chase Bank, because we need to put it together, okay? So here's another really amazing organization, Stop the Money Pipeline, and both of their websites have very practical stuff about what's going on and how to deal with it. And they're not saying, you know, get rid of all of your IRAs and all that. It's like, let's be thoughtful and let's go to work together on this. So, healthcare system, if it was a country, would be the 5th largest emitter in the world, okay? There's some brilliant people in my profession that I can proudly say have really looked into this and studied how this all works, all of the waste. Certain anesthesia gases are just shot up the chimneys and go out and contribute to greenhouse gases and all that. And there's some organizations, the 2 things listed at the top, that are really on this. And some fantastic healthcare systems have really gone into this deeply. Listed up there, including Dignity Health, which is the affiliate of our deal in Grass Valley. So any healthcare system can do this, and I hope that the local one gets on this soon. Last option, you can throw paint and soup on famous paintings. That's the passionate feeling that many of us have, especially the youth. But I hope that everybody will take the time to calmly and deliberately study all of the other action options that are available so that we can really go to work and make this happen. So, there you go. Thank you for your attention. I hope that you've learned a lot. So, Q&A. They're not going to kick us out at 8, are they? So come on up here, folks. So. I think this room is small enough that you can speak up your questions. So questions, concerns, clarifications.
I have a question for Dr. Haas. So we all know the effects of climate change, depression, loss of hope, and hopelessness. But I thought so interesting you brought up bipolar disorder. Could you spend a few seconds or a minute talking about that, and that I guess it was related to CNS effects of particulates?
Yeah, I mean, the data is not that strong, just to be a little bit honest about that. So there's one study that looks at ferritin levels and bipolar disorder, so that iron depletion was associated with a 5-fold increased risk of bipolar. That's huge. That's really, really huge. And it was a decent study. There's also several studies looking at bipolar disorder and air pollution. The onset of bipolar disorder in teenagers is associated between like ages 15 and 25. There's a lot of inflammatory changes in the brain at that time. So you might expect that anything that causes inflammation would potentially exacerbate bipolar disorder. It's been studied a lot less than depression, for example, right? So whereas there's like dozens of stories of depression and air pollution in various subtle ways, there's like 3 with bipolar disorder, if I'm thinking about it correctly. Yeah.
I have a question about population. Since the world just hit 8 billion, and how does that increase, exacerbate all this? And is anybody talking about that? It doesn't come up a lot, but the more people you have, the more use of resources, et cetera. And it's not really included in the discussions ever, because I think it's a dangerous topic, probably. But I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah, the more people, the more resources, the more emissions. I mean, there are per capita emissions, but a lot of it is still political decision making and distribution of those resources. So there was a environmental justice attorney that I think I mentioned briefly before who questioned the use of natural disasters as a term, and he talked about the Great Potato Famine, and that they were still exporting food at the time. And so that policy, people were still gaining economically while others were dying. And so it's really that disconnect and partial distribution as opposed to the total. Clearly the population's going to have a greater need as it grows, and it's growing fast. Can I ask a question? Since we have Mayor Henderson? So one of the big authors of that intergovernmental panel on climate change was at a community forum introduced by a local mayor and asked the mayor, so who knocks on your door? And the mayor said, not people talking about climate, but I get a lot of people talking about development and growth. How's it work? How's it feel? Because you're interested in kind of how things are built and the impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of our other, so I mentioned earlier that we have 5 core goals. Oh, sure. Thank you. And I should also note we have 2 other council members here. So Councilmember Klostad and Councilmember Zabriskie in the back. So one of our other 5 goals up on that wall is related to providing housing options. And so we think a lot about the interactions between climate, between housing, between what it means to actually build sustainably, to become a leader in that as a mountain town. And I think, the challenge is so many of these things are interrelated, right? You mentioned transportation earlier. We're doing a lot on our transportation solutions right now because we really want to get people out of their cars, not just for the health benefits of being able to walk or bike or things like that, but to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. When we think about, building and development, where are we actually locating and siting and zoning for that type of development? This council has really talked and prioritized a lot around infill development, right? We don't want to keep building out, really, really large developments in the WUI, in the wildland urban interface, because there are, tremendous greenhouse gas, impacts related to those if people have to travel farther. So we get a lot of our doors knocked on about development and housing, but this community is also, I think, a very climate-focused community. And so there's been tremendous support from the community in really pushing on a lot of different climate-related solutions. We just passed a ban on styrofoam, which I'm really excited about. It was overdue for us. And so, looking at all of the different ways where you can actually be working on climate. I'll just say briefly, I loved the slide earlier where you said, if you're doing this, you're working on climate solutions. If you're doing this, you're working on climate solutions. There's so many facets of that in our community. Who else has a question?
Yeah, let me throw out the elephant in the room, and that is the hope and hopelessness thing really hit me. The hope is that the good news that Brad has presented, the good things that we're all doing, we recognize need to be done and we're working on nationally, is terrific. My hopelessness is India, Indonesia, China. They're going to burn every last gallon of gasoline that they can get in this world to try to live, let alone live at our level of living, just to live. And that's my hopeless side. How do I deal with that?
I think it's, I mean, that is a painful reality. Right? That is a very painful reality. It is also true that they are going to suffer a lot with that reality, and that you don't have a lot of control over it. Right? There will be, potentially like millions of people dying of heat in India at the same time as they're burning those fossil fuels. And so, I don't have the answer to the question, and that's why people have tried to look for ways of proceeding, right, with uncertainty, with hopelessness, right, that still makes sense. Right? There's the idea of radical hope coming out. There was a little book written about that by Jonathan Lear, who's a philosopher, psychoanalyst in Chicago. And he tells the story of an Indian chief who was giving up his lands, right? And he knew things were going to be bad for many, many generations. And how was he going to deal with this, right? And he pulled on a dream that he had, and because he was Native American, he believed in his dreams, right? And he believed in the 7 generations legacy of the ancestors, and it was something about black and white things coming out of the earth, probably like cows from the white man, right? But that was just something that meant something to him. There will be change and things will survive, even if I can't yet imagine the possibilities. And so I would, think that is a place where I think potentially being uncertain could be extremely helpful, right? Because what do you really know about the education of women? How exactly India will respond when things escalate quickly? Will they decide to burn all of that oil in order to grow, right? There are some uncertainties, and I really don't pretend to have answers here, but just to introduce some other sort of openings into the way we look at it. Yeah.
I share your concern about that. And by the way, I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. I'm a doctor, I'm a dad. And I, have been reading a lot of stuff, listening to a lot of stuff. But, one thing is clear, and that is that the international process for this is very frustrating. It's very complicated. The recent COP meetings in Egypt, they accomplished something which was to get something on the table to at least financially try to start to address the inequities in the world of the people who are going to suffer the most from this, have contributed the least to the problem. So I guess where I'm going with that is that there is an international process, and these parties, the Indians, the Chinese, the other folks, are engaged in a process, and we're not where we need to be. Hopefully more wars won't be breaking out, which will totally break down the communication process, the engagement, because the Chinese people are pretty smart, and their system is very very difficult. The Indian population's very smart. They have a political process, and I just have to be hopeful that these political processes engage people in a way that's going to kind of bring them on board. And I don't have any evidence for that, but there is a process that is in place. And so, if we lacked that, I think it would be really hopeless, but there is some engagement. It's very difficult, though. So,
Say one more thing.
yeah.
Sorry, just thinking about it a little bit more, right? Back to this idea of dialectics, right? If you look at your own thinking on this, right, where do you feel stuck? Yeah. This is a bit of a shrinky thing to say, but it seems to me that you're feeling stuck in your hopelessness, right? That what you really can't find your way out of is these countries are stuck. It's going nowhere, right? We cannot count on them, right? And again, you may be correct about that. Right? But it might be also interesting to say that is where my emotions are stuck. Right? So if I flip it to the opposite at that moment, right,
and say, what is hopeful about the way India and China are developing, right? I might start to think about the leaders in those countries, the things that they're doing, ways that I might engage that kind of process, just as an intellectual exercise, right? But the point being to identify where am I stuck in the way that I'm viewing it, what could possibly happen here. I'm locked into this one particular way of looking at this particular aspect of it. Does that make sense a little bit?
Does. I like Brad's
Yeah.
that there is a process
Mm-hmm.
and that these people will be pushed into that process by discomfort in their own country. But then you see the Russians shutting off of the oil to Europe, and Europe kind of backtracking on the whole COP and pollution commitments that they had made. That makes you realize we all once again live for today more than, you know, esoterically we'd like.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I ask you a question too? I was really struck by some of the long-term mental health. I think I'm okay. No.
That way.
Oh, okay. Yeah, some of the long-term mental health around the chronic pollution exposure. But to be myopic for a minute, because we did have several of our young people in the house, do we know it seems to me up here, our kids are more exposed to these intense wildfire, heavy particle events versus the chronic pollution exposure to the kid growing up next to the freeway in 580 in the Bay or something. Do we know the events that we've been experiencing, the wildfire intense ones, better, worse, the same for the long-term implications of all the depression, all the negative outcomes that you kind of outlined? Do we have any idea?
Not exactly. I should probably speak into that again.
So I think there's an studying of wildfires so far. There's a lot of information about air pollution events. So, for example, after 3 to 5 days of very bad air pollution, a certain number of lag days later, you might see more depression, for example. Heart attacks, other things that come around a particular event, right, as opposed to the chronic exposure. But the studies that were done of kids and their developing brains were done around coal plants in China, around highways in Los Angeles, and so those were chronic exposures. I don't know that anybody's looked at an acute exposure and then looked at a child's brain 3 days later, right? The studies that were done of the pathological changes in kids' brains were done in Mexico City. The way those were done was that, first of all, the scientists doing them noticed that the dogs were all demented, and so she started autopsying the dogs, and then she started looking at the brains of kids that were killed in car accidents in Mexico City compared with the ones that were killed in the countryside where the air quality were better. So again, that was a long-term chronic exposure. So we just don't really have that data.
I think that we're very resilient, and when you look at the ACEs studies, like the kids who are exposed continually to stress are the ones that are the vulnerable ones that may get physical illnesses later. But when you look at stressful events, there's something called resilience, and if you can undo those effects in a way if you have periodic stress, and then you give the child security and the tools and so forth. Most kids do really, really well. They don't necessarily have this long-term stress, and that has to do with cortisol levels, adrenaline levels, all these things that affect your brain. So it's so I think that there's a lot of hope there, that if you create the right security and environment for a child, this is different than the coal plants. I'm thinking more about stressful events. People bounce back very well. So there's always the positive part of it, and that's what it's just like with illness. You can see someone who's diagnosed with cancer, and people who are ready to die are just going to auger in. But if a person's mental state is such that they have the hope, they have the positivity, there's so much information about that they do better. So we have a lot of power up here to help. And I think that's what we have to channel. We have to use that the best we can. None of us can solve all these problems, but your attitude makes a huge difference. And so that's the thing that I think that we need to remember. how you want things to turn out can make them turn out. I know that's the Pollyanna part, but that's why I'm a pediatrician, and it's true.
Say something.
Just the wildfire question is really important because they have changed, right, in terms of magnitude, duration, and also what's in the air. Because it used to be that a lot of the wildfires were really out in the forest. But now when you have 18,000 homes in Paradise go up, there are so many other chemicals from those houses, from their paint, what they were storing in the garage, etc. And so the composition has changed, and our research and our knowledge hasn't kept up with the changing pace and the changing type of wildfires.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to comment on. And I'm not an expert in this, but Climate Health Now is part of a consortium of people that put on annual medical conferences on this, and I was at, I was on a Zoom presentation last September where this group at UC Davis talked about they have in conjunction, I think, with Chico State, been really doing some research in the Paradise area where the campfire was, and several of the speakers mentioned that this is all very new. The research dollar, the resources, the interest in this, it's hard to collect it and focus it, but that's my alma mater. They are really tackling this, and so they're going to be learning a lot in hopefully the short term, 3 to 5 years. And it's definitely something needs to be looked at. So hopefully, at a meeting like this in the future, we'll be able to tell you more. This is all very new. They're studying firefighters around the world. And again, I can't report the data on that, but even that is relatively new research about what's happening to these guys after each of these battles that they wage. So I think there was another question. Yes.
So I have a question, and it's really for the handful of youth that we have in the room. A lot of the conversations that we're having, a lot of the actions and policies that we're putting into place are going to impact the next 20, 30 years for Truckee. And I really want to hear from you, if you're willing, how can your local government do a better job at engaging our youth in these types of conversations and discussions? Because I look around the room and we have a handful of youth. I'm so grateful that you're here, but most of the people in this room are my age or older. And we need you making these decisions with us.
I think one, I know kids, just silly thing, but I know kids are always more willing to go to events if there's snacks or things. But I think, I wonder, you mentioned because it's an interesting concept where often even in higher government there's certain regulations for age limits to be in there, but I wonder if maybe having, again, this is just a wild proposition, if having a group or a few kids or even one who would kind of almost like a mini government almost, definitely not making the policy, but maybe giving some opinions to policy that is being created. If anyone else has.
I guess kind of just adding on to what she said in a different way, I would say just maybe more integration into classrooms. It's we're learning about these things, we're learning about climate change in the classroom, but we're not learning about what we can do more. I've sadly never heard of these programs before because it's not advertised at school, and it's just it's having to be taught here in these meetings that a lot of students don't really even know about, so that it's just integration into the classroom would be more important.
I definitely agree with the integration into classrooms. I think that's really important. But I also think that the information that we're centering the education to students around is especially important because a lot of the information we're provided are like staggering graphs and things that many people won't understand, and it just seems overwhelming. So I think that if we talk more about the direct impact on the students, like when we were talking about children's health or impact on mental health, I think that that could get a lot more people interested if they can see the direct impacts that it will have on them, instead of like if it seems too big to accomplish anything, then it could seem unattainable.
And also to add to that, just giving students the opportunity to know about things like this meeting, to actually have the opportunity to come to it in the first place. Like I learned about this from Mr. Rowe here, my speech and debate teacher, and had he not brought it up in class, I wouldn't be here today. So just giving the opportunity to be aware of it in the first place is certainly super helpful in getting kids active and taking a stance in their community.
I kind of agree with all your points. Having like this integration into classrooms is super important. Getting like I don't want to say this, but getting like the government involved in schools, like having these meetings broadcasted into our school, like putting a poster on a wall, like, I don't know, like the meeting date, people will come, like if this is more broadcasted. Also getting, like kids are really interested right now in mental health. So these mental health aspects were something like I did not know about, and I think a lot of my friends and a lot of peers would find that extremely interesting. So getting people involved in that aspect I think would be huge. But yeah, I mean, just getting this type of meeting in schools, or even having a meeting like this like during a lunch period after school, people would come because people are interested, but there's just not like that connection between the kids and coming to meetings like this.
I'm going to turn it back, and I want to thank all of you. An open invitation. If you want to talk more about this and more strategies to engage our youth more, I want to hear from you. So it is an open invitation to have a conversation anytime.
And thank you for making that invitation.
It's my pleasure.
I was just going to mention I love those comments, and I would be willing to come back. And I also I have a pie business, and I would bring pie, and then there would be a reason to come. So.
One of my impossible to read slides, there was actually a question from the Yale communication team of their people they polled nationally, said, should we deal with this more in the schools? And it was definitely a strong majority that said, yep. So, yeah, and Deirdre, please, you should be up here too, because Deirdre knows so much more about a lot of this stuff.
I just want to say we're going to have to end our Q&A session. This has been very, very interesting. I do want to mention that my personal suggestion for how we could have our youth engage more in the climate issue is by talking to them less about the science and more about how they can civically engage on the issue. In other words, how can they become good citizen advocates? Those are the skills that our kids need if we want to hear from them. And that's something that I think our schools could help with. So.
So my 15-year-old is sitting here, but there was a Facebook post that a babysitter sent us a few days ago, and it was a picture of Elijah as a fourth grader or fifth grader or something with this Shane McConkney challenge. Do you guys know about this? But that was the impetus for the Styrofoam band, right? And that was in the elementary schools, right? And they put up money, and the kids got really competitive, and they came up with projects. And there was a picture of him sitting here as this little guy, So that's great, these kind of projects. So yeah.
Well, also I think like quick action steps are really important. Like just while this information is extremely important for kids to have, like what you said, the science can kind of go over people's heads sometimes. So having like action steps, things to do, like meetings with people, like actual like attainable goals is really important instead of just spreading information. Like while that information is extremely important to spread, the general population knows about a lot of this stuff and knows that climate change is awful, but they don't really know how to get started in changing their lifestyle or helping change their community's lifestyle. So having like, I don't have an idea off the top of my head, but a quick like action step, like you can go here and do exactly this. Like I think people would be motivated to do that.
Climate almost every time.
Yeah, you can make public comments at any meetings in our community. I also want to let you know that in Citizens Climate Lobby, when we go to lobby, we often bring young people with us. We've had middle schoolers come with us. One of our most effective climate advocates at one of our congressional meetings was an 11-year-old. So there's a real role for young people in engaging with the people who make decisions for us in our government, our elected officials. They respond to us. They know that you're the constituents of the future. And Citizens Climate Lobby will help you to learn how to be effective climate advocates. And I also want to mention that we have a youth division within our chapter called the Tahoe Youth Action Team, which has just started this school year with its first meeting. And you're welcome to join with them because they have a number of things that they are planning to do this year that involved students becoming involved, engaged politically in our community and at the national level when we go to talk with members of Congress. So I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, all of our panelists. We are so pleased that you came to see us. We hope we are going, this is going to be available for streaming on Tahoe Truckee Media, and it will probably also be rebroadcast on Tahoe Truckee Media. So please tell other people about it. Tell them to watch. Thank you again for coming.